David Carter was on the brink of greatness, gripping the cool metal railing of a high-rise in Manhattan. From his office, the city stretched below in a wild mix of lights and sounds, a perfect backdrop for his ambition. To David, success was everything. The thought of expanding his business overseas had hooked him, fueling dreams of real wealth and influence. Emma Carter, his wife, watched from their cozy Brooklyn apartment as David's world shifted into something she barely recognized. Emma had always been his rock, a teacher who valued community over ambition, happiness over status. She cherished the life they'd built together. But as David's sights turned toward distant horizons, a quiet distance grew between them. "Emma, you know I have to do this," David said one evening over dinner, his voice oddly flat, his eyes already far away. Emma glanced down, pushing her fork around her plate. "Do you, though?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. She knew he wouldn't stay. His dreams had grown way too big for their simple life. Days turned to weeks, and the time for David to leave drew closer. Their conversations grew shallow, quick exchanges that had none of the warmth they used to have. Emma struggled with whether to tell him about the baby. Her heart weighed down by her indecision. She didn't want to tie him down, afraid it might keep him from the life he seemed so sure he wanted. One quiet evening, Emma made her choice. She watched David pack his bags with a calm she forced herself to hold on to, her hands resting gently over her barely there baby bump. She'd raised this child on her own, letting David go live his dreams. She mourned the life they might have shared together, but she'd made her peace. "Take care of yourself, Emma," David said at the door, his tone somewhere between excitement and finality. She nodded, her words caught in her throat. Sensing that this goodbye was far from temporary, as he left, a wave of finality washed over her, and she knew their lives would never be the same. Emma watched as the taxi carried David away, her fingers brushing over the small life she'd carry alone. She whispered words of encouragement to herself. Feeling both terrified and determined, she knew the road ahead would be tough, but she'd made her choice, and she clung to it with all her heart. David's new life overseas took off fast. He was always on the go, with his business expanding into a multinational company. Success was intoxicating, and for years he hardly looked back. The life he'd left in Brooklyn fading into a distant memory. Ambition had taken hold of him, filling in the gaps where family once fit. Meanwhile, Emma settled into her new role as a mum. She poured all the love and warmth she once shared with David into raising their son, Jacob. Her days were a balance of teaching and motherhood. Her heart split between her students and her beloved son, whose smile sometimes reminded her of the man she once loved. In quiet moments, Emma would wonder if David ever thought of her, or even imagined the son he'd never met. Sometimes she wanted to reach out but kept silent, choosing to let him live the life he'd chosen. For Emma, life became a dance between making peace with the past and focusing on her son's future. As the years went by, David immersed himself even further into his professional life, with his company expanding worldwide. The thrill and prestige of his achievements filled his days, and he rarely thought of his old life back in Brooklyn. For him, life had become all about success and power. Emma, on the other hand, found peace in her own world. Her days were full of laughter and challenges as she raised Jacob, the boy who kept her grounded and strong. His joy, his little victories, gave her a purpose she never thought possible. She poured her heart into being the mother she had promised herself to be. Jacob was growing fast, curious about everything around him. He had Emma's kindness, but David's sharp curiosity, traits that made her both proud and wistful. When people commented on how Jacob looked just like his dad, Emma would simply smile, hiding the pang of sadness she felt inside. Meanwhile, David's life grew increasingly demanding. Business trips, meetings, and endless responsibilities filled his calendar. There were days he barely had time to think, let alone reflect on the life he'd left behind. If thoughts of Emma or what could have been ever surfaced, he pushed them away. Emma often found herself wondering what life would have been like if David had stayed. But each time Jacob laughed or hugged her, she felt that everything had happened as it should. She focused on giving Jacob a happy life, putting the past behind her one day at a time. There were moments, however, when Emma wished she could share Jacob's milestones with David. Watching Jacob take his first steps, hearing his first words, these were memories Emma held close to her heart. She thought about reaching out, but the thought would quickly fade. David's world was far from theirs now. Jacob would sometimes ask about his father, and Emma would choose her words carefully. She explained that his dad was a busy man who had big dreams. Jacob would nod, accepting her gentle explanations, though sometimes Emma caught a glimpse of longing in his eyes. She would hug him a little tighter. David's life was one of luxury and success, but there was an emptiness that lingered. Late at night, in moments of rare solitude, he'd feel a vague sense of loss, a hint of something he couldn't quite name. Yet he'd dismiss it, thinking his achievements would be enough to fill that gap. Emma continued to build a fulfilling life with Jacob, feeling lucky to watch him grow. The community became her support system, her friends and neighbors always ready to lend a hand. The simple joy of family dinners, school plays, and neighborhood gatherings gave her a happiness that no amount of wealth could buy. Little by little, the life she'd built with Jacob became her whole world. Her past with David began to feel like a distant dream, a chapter she'd closed long ago. Yet she sometimes wondered if he ever thought of them, of the family he left behind in the name of ambition. Jacob was now a teenager, curious and bright, the spitting image of his father. Emma couldn't deny the resemblance. Jacob's strong jawline and keen eyes mirrored David's. She saw glimpses of David's intensity in him, which stirred emotions she kept buried deep down. Emma continued working as a teacher, finding satisfaction in the lives she touched. Her students adored her, and she found purpose in helping them grow, just as she had done with Jacob. The work fulfilled her, grounding her in a way that reminded her she was exactly where she was meant to be. Across the world, David's business empire flourished, expanding into new markets and breaking records. He had everything he'd dreamed of, money, influence, and power, but as he grew older, the thrill of success didn't feel as intoxicating as it once had. Something in him felt incomplete. David would sometimes sit alone, gazing out at the city lights, feeling an odd sense of loneliness. He had dedicated his life to his work, yet the sense of fulfillment he'd expected still eluded him. He occasionally thought about Emma and wondered in brief flashes what might have been. Emma and Jacob developed a beautiful, unbreakable bond. He was her pride and joy, a young man with compassion and a good heart. They had a tradition of taking weekend walks around their Brooklyn neighborhood, talking about everything under the sun. It was their time, filled with laughter and closeness. Jacob was now old enough to start asking deeper questions. "Mum, do you ever miss Dad?" he asked one day as they strolled through the park. Emma paused, caught off guard, then nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes," she said softly, "but I think we're exactly where we're supposed to be." Meanwhile, David's reflections grew sharper, more insistent. He wondered about Emma, the woman who had once been his world. He questioned the choices that had led him away from her, wondering if all he'd gained was worth the life he'd left behind. His doubts began to chip away at his confidence. Jacob's talents became more apparent as he entered college. He was passionate about business, a subject Emma encouraged but couldn't help but find ironic. The irony wasn't lost on her. But she hid her feelings, knowing that Jacob's path was his own. She was proud of the man he was becoming. David's business colleagues often praised his achievements, yet he felt disconnected from the admiration. The life he had poured himself into now felt hollow, like an echo of the excitement he'd once felt. He had reached his goals, but at what cost? The question haunted him in quieter moments. Emma continued to quietly wonder if David would ever know about Jacob, the son he'd never met. She had kept her promise to herself, letting him go so he could live his dreams. Yet the idea of him meeting Jacob one day lingered in her heart. A hope she couldn't quite abandon. As Jacob grew into a confident young adult, Emma watched him with a mix of pride and awe. He had a natural charisma, a knack for business, and a good heart, traits that reminded her so much of David. Yet Jacob had also inherited her grounded nature, valuing connections and sincerity over ambition alone. Jacob excelled in his studies, and his professors frequently praised his dedication and intelligence. Emma saw in him a beautiful blend of her own values and David's ambition. She marveled at the path he was on, knowing he was charting his own course, but sometimes feeling a pang of nostalgia for what could have been. David's life, however, felt less fulfilling than ever. His massive corporate empire was everything he'd dreamed of, but it was a cold, lonely achievement. He felt a gnawing emptiness that success couldn't fill, and he wondered if the choices he'd made were worth the sacrifices. In moments of silence, David found himself reflecting on Emma, imagining the life they might have shared. He began to feel the weight of missed opportunities and the love he'd left behind. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the consequences of the life he'd chosen. Emma continued to nurture her role as a mother and a teacher. She was grateful for the life she had built with Jacob, even though it was nothing like the future she had once envisioned. Her heart felt full, and yet there was still a small, lingering question about David's place in their lives. Jacob sensed the unspoken history between his parents, though he never pressed Emma for answers. His mother had given him all the love and support he needed, and he was grateful. Still, as he grew older, he couldn't help but wonder about the man who had given him his ambition and drive. As David entered his 60s, he began pulling back from his work, delegating more responsibilities to his staff. He felt a desire for something different, a sense of home, a connection he hadn't felt in decades. Yet he didn't know how to bridge the gap he'd created with his choices. Emma, too, was beginning to embrace a new chapter in her life. She felt more confident, having raised a wonderful son and made a difference in her students' lives. She knew that she had become the woman she was meant to be, but there was still a quiet longing to see David, to share their history with him. Jacob graduated from college, ready to take on the world, and Emma felt both pride and a bittersweet ache. She had raised him alone, a choice she'd made long ago. But there were moments when she wished David could see the man their son had become. She wondered if he'd be proud. As Jacob pursued his career, he became curious about his father. He sensed the quiet sorrow in his mother's eyes whenever he mentioned David, and he wanted to understand his own roots. Emma had always respected his curiosity, even as it stirred unresolved feelings in her heart. 27 years after David left, fate brought him and Emma to the same airport on a rainy afternoon. David, now older and graying, was returning from yet another business trip, feeling weary and reflective. The airport was busy, filled with people rushing to and fro. Emma and Jacob stood at a nearby gate waiting for a flight. Jacob, now 26, stood tall, his presence commanding attention. David's eyes wandered as he waited, and they landed on a young man with a strikingly familiar face. A strange feeling washed over him, making him freeze in his tracks. The young man's strong jawline, intense gaze, and confident stance looked exactly like David's own from years ago. David felt a wave of confusion and curiosity, a strange, unsettling feeling that made him tremble. The resemblance was uncanny, and he found himself unable to look away. Emma noticed David across the crowded terminal, her heart stopping as recognition set in. She hadn't seen him in decades, yet his face still brought back a flood of memories. She felt a mixture of emotions, surprise, nervousness, and a glimmer of sorrow for the years that had passed. Jacob, noticing his mother's sudden reaction, followed her gaze. "Mom?" he asked, sensing her tension. Emma hesitated, her eyes filling with emotions she'd kept buried. "That's your father," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. Jacob's eyes widened as he processed her words. David approached them slowly, his eyes locked on Jacob. The realization hit him like a wave, and his legs felt weak. He looked at Emma, his face a mixture of confusion and regret, before turning back to the young man he now knew was his son. The weight of lost years crashed over him. "Emma? Jacob?" David's voice was unsteady, heavy with emotion. Jacob studied him, trying to connect this stranger to the father he'd always imagined. Emma placed a hand on Jacob's arm, silently supporting him as they faced the man who had once meant everything to her. David's voice broke as he spoke. "I had no idea. Emma, why didn't you tell me?" Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You had your dreams, David. I didn't want to hold you back. I did what I thought was best." Her words were calm, but they carried years of unspoken pain. Jacob listened, his heart pounding as he tried to process this revelation. The man standing before him was his father, a stranger who had once been his mother's whole world. He didn't know how to feel. Anger, sadness, curiosity, all mingled together, leaving him at a loss for words. The three of them stood there, the bustling airport fading into the background as they faced the truth. Years of silence and separation hung between them, yet in this moment, they felt an undeniable connection. It was a reunion filled with regret, but also a fragile hope for healing. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, each of them grappling with the weight of years gone by. David, feeling the enormity of his absence, searched Jacob's face, desperate to understand the son he had never known. Jacob's expression remained guarded, his emotions unreadable. I never knew," David said, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes filled with regret. Jacob looked at him, feeling both anger and a strange sense of pity. He had grown up without his father, but seeing David's broken expression, he realized the absence had hurt them both. Emma, standing between them, could feel the tension and pain, a culmination of choices made long ago. She gently placed her hand on David's shoulder, an unspoken forgiveness passing between them. "We all did what we thought was best," she said softly, trying to ease the bitterness. David's gaze shifted to Emma, his eyes filling with years of words unsaid. "I'm so sorry, Emma. I was selfish," he confessed, his voice heavy with remorse. Emma's lips curved into a sad smile. "We both chose our paths, David, but there's no changing the past," she replied with quiet acceptance. Jacob watched the exchange, feeling a mix of emotions, curiosity, resentment, and a strange hope that things might change. He hadn't expected this moment, yet here it was, and he wanted answers. "Why did you leave?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying a sharp edge. David looked at Jacob, his son, and took a deep breath. "I thought success would be enough. I thought it was all I needed," he admitted, his tone raw. "But I see now what I gave up. I missed out on knowing you, and it's my biggest regret." His voice wavered, as he spoke the truth. The three of them stood in silence, the weight of David's words settling over them. Emma felt a sense of closure, knowing that, at last, David understood what he'd sacrificed. For her, the years apart had given her a chance to grow and find peace, but she knew this was a new beginning for them all. Jacob softened, sensing the genuine remorse in his father's voice. Part of him still ached from years of not knowing his dad. But there was another part that felt a longing to bridge the gap. "I don't know how to feel about all this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emma placed her hand on Jacob's back, giving him a comforting smile. "You don't have to decide now," she assured him. "Just know that we're here. Together, and that's a start." Her words held a promise of healing, of moving forward without the burden of past resentments. David looked at Emma and Jacob, feeling gratitude mixed with grief. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he wanted to be part of their lives if they'd let him. "I want to know you." "Jacob," he said, his voice full of a quiet hope. Jacob gave a slight nod, his heart slowly opening to the possibility. In the days following their reunion, David, Emma, and Jacob met regularly, slowly piecing together the fragments of their lives. They shared meals, laughter, and stories that allowed them to see each other in new ways. David found himself opening up in a way he hadn't for years. Jacob, cautiously at first, began to ask David questions about his life and the choices he'd made. David answered honestly, not shying away from the regrets and mistakes. Jacob listened, beginning to see his father as a flawed but sincere man who had paid dearly for his ambitions. Emma watched the father and son grow closer, feeling a bittersweet joy. She had done her best to raise Jacob alone, but she saw now that having David in his life gave him something she alone could never provide. It was a piece of his identity, a connection to his roots. Over time, David and Jacob developed a bond built on honesty and understanding. They still had much to learn about each other, but every shared moment felt like a gift. David was grateful for each day he spent with Jacob, cherishing the relationship he had once thought impossible. Emma, too, found closure in the process. She had carried the weight of David's absence for years. But seeing him as he was now, regretful, humbled, and willing to change, allowed her to finally let go of any lingering bitterness. She felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. One afternoon, as they all walked through the park, David turned to Emma, his voice soft. "Thank you, Emma, for everything, for raising Jacob and for giving me this chance." Emma smiled warmly, her heart full. "It was never easy, but it was worth it," she replied, her words carrying years of meaning. Jacob looked at his parents, feeling grateful for this unexpected reunion. He had spent years wondering about his father, but now he knew he could build his own future with both of them in it. He felt complete, no longer haunted by questions about his past. In quiet moments, David reflected on the life he had missed out on, but he no longer let regret consume him. He was determined to make the most of this new chapter, to be the father he never was. He found fulfillment not in achievements, but in the relationships he was finally building. Emma continued to focus on her life, content with the family they had become. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing they had all found their way back to each other. The years of separation were behind them, and what lay ahead was a journey they would walk together. Together, David, Emma, and Jacob embraced their second chance, creating a life that celebrated both the past and the future. They had faced loss, made peace with it, and moved forward with open hearts. Their story was one of forgiveness, transformation, and the enduring strength of family.